One of the most frequent questions I get is what happens if my company changes size? Okay, so what happens if we, for example, buy a new shop or buy an extra plant to do this, that and the other? It's very easy to do. We use carbon intensities. Let's run through what that looks like. If your company's growing, there's a fair chance that you're going to be emitting more carbon than you did before. Okay, it's not guaranteed, but general rule of thumb, the more stuff you do, the more carbon you're going to emit. Let's say, for example, you've got an office in Birmingham and for some reason you just bought another office in Swansea. There's a fair chance your carbon footprint's going to go up. So how do you account for that? Well, the answer is you use carbon intensities. And a carbon intensity is very simple to sort of explain. It's the amount of carbon you emit per thing you do. So, for example, in the example of the Swansea office, you might say it's the amount of carbon you emit per square foot of office space you've just acquired. Now, that's typically expressed, for example, of TCO2e, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And the equivalent bit, have a look at previous videos, I've explained all about what that means. But TCO2 per square foot. So you divide your total emissions by some sort of metric that gives you an indication of the size of your company. And that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that your company can go bigger or smaller, but the carbon you emit per something or other will always either stay the same or, in our case, reduce down. Okay, and that's how we account for the change. Now, if you want to think about what you should use as a metric for your company, you can use my standing at the bar rule. My standing at the bar rule is when you chat to people at a bar, after an event or something like that, and you say, how did you get on last year? How did your company do last year? What's the answer to that question, the off-the-cuff answer? If it's, for example, we doubled turnover, then turnover's the metric. Okay, if you say, oh, that's fantastic, we took on 6 new buses last year, then it's per bus. If you say, for example, well, we doubled production last year, then it's, per ton of production, whatever you produce, the material produced. So, that's the quick and easy way of finding out what metric you should use. There are some standards, and they're becoming more and more common. So I think as we go along, you'll see certain industry sectors adopting more standard metrics of carbon intensities. But some common ones for you are kilograms of CO2 per pound of turnover. That's extremely common because it's so simple to work out. Okay, it's just used all over the place. I suspect the government might go for that because it's a dead easy one. But kilograms CO2 per pound produced. Don't forget that's equivalent. It's the same thing as tons of CO2 per pound of turnover. You just got more sort of decimal points and more zeros before the figures, which is the same as tons of CO2 per 1,000 pounds of turnover, which is the same as tons of CO2 per million pound of turnover. All you're trying to do is get the figure so it just looks nice on the page and loads of zeros before it or after it, okay? But basically, kilograms of CO2 per pound of turnover. Now, science-based targets like a different version of that, okay? And they have kilograms of CO2 per pound of value created, which can translate broadly into profit, okay? So another common metric, because again, it's quite easy to work out, is tons of CO2e, so TCO2e per, for example, 1,000 pound of profit or per million pound of profit. Okay, so turnover and profit, very, very simple ones. If you want more, I'll give you a couple of examples in a second, but if you want more detail, have a look at my book, Net Zero for Business. It's a really practical guide, takes you through all these sort of things step by step. If you're a techie, then have a look at nistic.earth, which is the software that we use, which just kind of does all this stuff for you. So there's 2 other resources for you there. But other common ones you might see are if you've got a production manufacturing facility, it is generally on production. So it's tons of CO2 per, for example, ton of steel produced, or per ton of, sort of chemical produced. And one of my clients, a couple other in the pharma business, is kilograms CO2 per, 1,000 pills produced, etc. That's very common. And that's probably sector specific for manufacturing companies. Another one that's sector specific would be construction. So you have, for example, kilograms of CO2 per square foot of property delivered, constructed, or per square meter, that sort of thing. And they look at the amount of carbon you emit per area of sort of house or office that you build. Other ones in the consulting sector would be tons of CO2 per staff member, or per consultant. That's very common. And you got to look at education, tons of CO2 per pupil or kilogram CO2 per pupil. Hotels, tons of CO2 per guest night, etc., etc. So have a think about how we would answer that bar question. You're standing up at the bar, someone said, how's your company doing? So, oh great, we doubled our whatever it is. That's generally the metric you should think about when using intensities. Okay, I'll leave you with one sort of comment, which is you don't have to just use intensities or just use absolute, i.e. the total amount you emit. You can combine them. So if you have a target reduction, you can combine both your absolute emissions and your intensities quite easily. It's not a problem at all. So you could say, for example, by 2030, we look to reduce our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by, for example, 45%. That's an absolute reduction, yeah? And our tons of CO2 per tons of CO2e per ton of aluminium produced by 45%. Or you could say, for example, if you're a school, we're going to reduce our scope 1 and scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by, for example, 70% by 2030, and our kilograms of CO2 per pupil by, whatever it's going to be, 20%, 30%, what it's going to be. So you can combine them, and that makes a really sort of flexible plan. You can say, look, we understand about gas, we understand it's nasty stuff, we are going to try and decarbonize, that's all going on. And then, on the variable side, you've got the kilograms of CO2 per pupil, and that's what we're going to try and reduce down depending on how many pupils we get each year. Okay, I hope that was useful. If it was, check out the two resources, the book and the software, and I'll see you next time.